Hello. I'm going to tell a story by Jack London, The Law of Life, published in 1901. Old Cascouche listened greedily. His sight had long since faded, but his hearing was still acute. The slightest sound penetrated to the glimmering intelligence behind his withered forehead. Ah, that was Sitcomtuha, her shrill voice cursing the dogs as she cuffed and beat them into the harnesses. Sitcomtuha was his daughter's daughter, but she was too busy to waste a thought upon her broken grandfather, sitting alone in the snow, forlorn and helpless. Camp must be broken. The long trail waited, while the short day refused to linger. Life called her, and the duties of life, not death. And he was now very near death. The thought made the old man panic for a moment. He stretched forth a palsied hand. It trembled and wandered over the small heap of dry wood beside him. Reassured that it was indeed there, his hand returned to the shelter of his mangy furs. Again he fell to listening. The crackling of half-frozen hides told him the chief's moose-skin lodge had been struck, and even then was being rammed into portable pieces. The chief was his son, stalwart and strong, head of the tribe, and a mighty hunter. As the women toiled to load the sleds, his son's voice rose, chiding them for their slowness. Old Cascouche strained his ears. It was the last time he would hear that voice. There went another lodge, and another. 7, 8, 9. Only the shamans could be still standing. There, they were at work upon it now. He could hear the shaman grunt as he piled it on the sled. A child whimpered, and a woman soothed it with her soft, crooning voice. Little Cootie, thought the old man, a fretful child, and not overly strong. It would die soon, perhaps, and they would burn a hole through the frozen tundra and pile rocks above to keep the wolverines away. Well, what did it matter? A few years at best, and as many an empty belly as a full one. And in the end, death waited, ever hungry, hungriest of them all. What was that? Ah, the men lashing the sleds and drawing tight the thongs. He listened, he who would listen no more. The whiplashes snarled and bit among the dogs. Hear them whine, how they hated the trail. Now they were off. Sled after sled churned slowly away into the silence. They were gone. They had passed out of his life, and he faced the last bitter hour alone. No, the snow crunched beneath a moccasin. A man stood beside him. A hand rested gently upon his head. His son was good to do this thing. He remembered other old men whose sons had not waited after the tribe was gone, but his son had. His thoughts wandered into the past till the young man's voice brought him back. Is it well with you? The old man answered, It is well. The younger man continued, There be wood beside you, and the fire burns bright. The morning is gray, and the cold is broken. It will snow soon. Even now is it snowing. The old man nodded. Even now is it snowing. His son looked at him with solemn respect. The tribesmen hurry. Their bales are heavy, and their bellies are flat with lack of feasting. The trail is long, and they travel fast. I go now. It is well. Cascouche replied, It is well. I am as a last year's leaf clinging lightly to the stem, the first breath that blows, and I fall. My voice is become old. My eyes no longer show me the way of my feet, and my feet are heavy, and I am tired. It is well. He bowed his head in content till the last noise of the complaining snow had died away, and he knew his son was gone. Then in haste his hand crept out to the wood. It alone stood between him and the eternity awaiting him. At last, the measure of his life was a handful of sticks and twigs. One by one, they would go to feed the fire, and just so, step by step, death would creep upon him. When the last stick had surrendered up its heat, the frost would begin to gather strength. First, his feet would yield, then his hands, and then slowly. The numbness would travel from the extremities to the body. His head would fall forward upon his knees, and he would rest. It was easy. Everyone must die. Kaskush did not complain. It was the way of life, and it was just. He had been born close to the earth. He had lived close to the earth, and the law thereof was not new to him. It was the law of all flesh. Nature was not kindly to the flesh. She had no concern for the individual. Her interest lay in the species. This was the deepest abstraction his mind could fathom, but he grasped it firmly. He saw it exemplified in all life. The rise of the sap, the bursting greenness of the willow bud, the fall of the yellow leaf. In this alone was told the whole of history. But one task did nature set the individual, to produce offspring. Did he not perform it, he died. If he did perform it, he died. It was all the same. Nature didn't care. There were plenty who were obedient, and it was the obedience in this matter, not those who were obedient, which lived, and lived always. The tribe of Kaskush was very old. The old men he had known, when a boy, had known old men before them, and therefore the tribe lived. And it stood for the obedience of all its members, way down into the forgotten past, whose very resting places were unremembered. They did not count. They were episodes. They had passed away like clouds from a summer sky. He also was an episode, and he, too, would pass away. Nature didn't care. To life she set one task and gave one law. The task of life was to perpetuate. Its law was death. A maiden was a good creature to look upon, full-breasted and strong, with spring in her step and light in her eyes. But her task was yet before her. The light in her eyes brightened, her step quickened. She was now bold with the young men, now timid, and she gave them of her own unrest. And ever she grew fairer and yet fairer to look upon. Till some hunter, able no longer to withhold himself, took her to his lodge to cook and toil for him, and to become the mother of his children. And with the coming of her offspring, her looks left her. Her limbs dragged and shuffled, her eyes dimmed and bleared, and only the little children found joy against the withered cheek of the old squaw by the fire. Her task was done. But a little while, on the first pinch of famine, or the first long trail, and she would be left, even as he had been left, alone in the snow with a little pile of wood. Such was the law. Kaskush placed a stick carefully upon the fire and resumed his meditations. It was the same everywhere with all things. The mosquitoes vanished with the first frost. The little tree squirrel crawled away to die. When age settled upon the rabbit, it grew slow and heavy, no longer able to outfoot its enemies. Even the big horse grew clumsy and blind and quarrelsome, in the end to be dragged down by a handful of yelping huskies. He remembered how he had abandoned his own father one winter on an upper reach of the Klondike. It was the year before the missionary came with his box of medicines. Kaskush smacked his lips over the recollection of those medicines. The painkiller had been especially good. But the missionary was a bother after all, for he brought no meat into the camp, and he ate heartily, and the hunters grumbled. In the end, he chilled his lungs on the divide by Lake Mackenzie, and afterwards the dogs nosed the stones away and fought over his bones. Kaskush placed another stick on the fire and harked back deeper into the past. There was the time of the Great Famine, when the old men crouched empty-bellied to the fire and let fall from their lips dim traditions of the ancient day when the Yukon ran wide open for 3 winters and then lay frozen for 3 summers. He had lost his mother in that famine. In the summer, the salmon run had failed, and the tribe looked forward to the winter and the coming of the caribou. But when the winter came, there were no caribou. Never had the like been known, not even in the lives of the old men. But the caribou did not come, and it was the 7th year, and the rabbits had not replenished, and the dogs were naught but bundles of bones. And in the long darkness the children wailed and died, and the women and the old men. Not 1 in 10 of the tribe lived to meet the sun when it came back in the spring. That was a famine. But he had also seen times of plenty, when the meat spoiled on their hands, and the dogs were fat with overeating. Times when they let the game go unkilled, and the women were fertile, and the lodges were cluttered with sprawling children. It was then the men revived ancient quarrels and crossed the divides to the south to kill the Pellies. He remembered when he was a boy, during a time of plenty, when he saw a moose pulled down by the wolves. Zingha lay beside him in the snow, and they watched together. He and Zingha had gone out that day to play at hunting after the manner of their fathers. On the bed of the creek, they struck the fresh track of a moose, and with it the tracks of many wolves. "An old one," said Zingha, who was quicker at reading the signs. "An old one who cannot keep up with the herd. The wolves have cut him out from his brothers, and they will not leave him." And it was so. It was their way. By day and by night, never resting, snarling on his heels, snapping at his nose, they would stay by him to the end. How he and Zingha felt the bloodlust quicken. The finish would be a sight to see. Eager-footed, they took to the trail. Hot were they on the heels of the chase, reading the grim tragedy, fresh written at every step. Now they came to where the moose had made a stand. In every direction had the snow been stamped about and uptossed. In the midst were the deep impressions of the splay-hoofed moose, and all about were the lighter footmarks of the wolves. One wolf had been caught in a wild lunge by the maddened victim, and trampled to death. A few bones, well picked, bore witness. Again their snowshoes stopped. It was a second stand where the great animal had fought desperately. Twice had he been dragged down, as the snow attested, and twice had he shaken free his assailants and regained his footing. His task had been done long since, but nonetheless was life dear to him. Xingha said it was a strange thing, a moose once down, to get free again, but this one certainly had. And yet again they came to where the moose had made to mount the bank and gain the timber. But his foes had laid on from behind, till he reared and fell back upon them, crushing two wolves deep into the snow. It was plain the kill was at hand, for the trail was now red, and the clean stride of the great beast had grown short and slovenly. Now they heard the first sounds of the battle, not the full-throated chorus of the chase, but the short, snappy bark which spoke of close quarters and teeth to flesh. Moving upwind, Xingha and Cascouche crawled through the snow. Together they shoved aside the branches of a young spruce and peered forth. And together they watched the grisly end. This picture from the distant past, like all of youth's impressions, was still strong with him. And now his dim eyes watched the end played out, as vividly as in that far-off time. For a long while he pondered on the days of his youth, till the fire died down and the frost bit deeper. He replenished it with 2 sticks this time, and gauged his grip on life by what remained. If Sitcom-Tuha had only remembered her grandfather and gathered a larger armful, his hours would have been longer. It would have been easy. But she was ever a careless child, and honored not her ancestors. Well, what did it matter? Had he not done likewise in his own quick youth? For a while, he listened to the silence. Perhaps the heart of his son might soften, and he would return with the dogs to take his old father on with the tribe to where the caribou ran thick. He strained his ears, and the moment became still. Not a stir. Nothing. He alone took breath in the great silence. It was lonely. Very lonely. Wait, what was that? A chill passed over his body. The familiar long-drawn howl broke the void, and it was close at hand. Then on his darkened eyes was projected the vision of the moose, the old bull moose, the torn flanks and bloody sides, the riddled mane, the great branching horns tossing to the last. He saw the flashing forms of gray, the gleaming eyes, the lolling tongues, the slavered fangs, and he saw the inexorable circle close in, till it became a dark point in the midst of the stamped snow. A cold muzzle thrust against his cheek, and its touch brought him back to the present. His hand shot into the fire and dragged out a burning stick. The brute retreated, overcome, for the moment, by his hereditary fear of man, raising a long, prolonged call to his brothers, and greedily they answered, till a ring of crouching, jaw-slobbered gray was stretched round about. The old man listened to the closing in of this circle. He flashed his brand wildly, and sniffs turned to snarls, but the panting brutes refused to scatter. Now one crept forward, now a second, now a third, and never a one drew back. Why should he cling to life? He asked. Then he dropped the blazing stick into the snow. It sizzled and went out. The circle grunted uneasily, but held its own. Again he saw the last stand of the old bull moose. Then Koskoosh dropped his head wearily upon his knees. What did it matter? Was it not the law of life?